Tonight I want to talk about another recovery danger. And when we started this series, it hadn't fully occurred to me just that everything that I would teach addicts about recovery dangers are the things that are being forced on addicts to live in during this social isolation time due to the coronavirus. And so this experience for us as a culture is really a dangerous situation for people coming out of complex trauma and in recovery from addiction. Over the past couple weeks, I've heard a number of people say that as each week has progressed, their mental health has got worse. And as I thought of my own experience, and I live with depression issues, I would concur that the last 2 weeks have been especially difficult with depression things. And so I thought it was an important thing to talk about because we knew up front going into this social isolation that it would be a challenge for people with mental health issues, but we weren't sure just exactly how badly it would affect people. What is important, I think, to understand is that for people coming out of complex trauma, about 90% struggle with mental health issues. It goes with complex trauma. Depression and anxiety are the main two mental health issues that come out of that. So that is kind of a constant thing that they can deal with. Medication can help them deal with it a little bit, but there's still ups and downs. What researchers have found out is even though they're fairly stable, there are certain things that can trigger those mental health issues to go downhill in a hurry. And that's what's happened to a lot of people over the last few weeks with this social isolation. I came across an article done by a psychological paper out of the UK, and it says this: the following factors could potentially result in a period of poor mental health. In other words, it's saying that certain things can trigger mental health issues. Social isolation or loneliness. Exactly what we've been living with and talking about. Losing someone close to you. Severe or long-term stress can trigger mental health issues to flare up. Having a long-term physical health condition, unemployment, losing your job, poor housing, homelessness, being a long-term carer for someone with physical or mental health issues, drug and alcohol misuse, domestic violence, bullying, or other abuse as an adult, being involved in a serious incident in which you feared for your life, or being the victim of a violent crime. Someone said this: my depression seems to flare up during times when I am stressed and isolated from other people. And that's what that article is saying, and that's what this social isolation period throughout the world is creating, is people are having depression, anxiety, and other mental health things flare up. So I want to talk about that tonight, and then again, hopefully end with some tools that are helpful for you. So I have mentioned that complex trauma creates mental health issues. And more I see research that supports that, and I see it all the time. When I started in the addiction treatment world 16 plus years ago, it was said at that time that about 60% of addicts had mental health issues. But I saw a lot more than that. And once complex trauma research came out, I began to say, no, about 90% plus have mental health issues. And that has been very important for people to understand. What I then have seen is this: if a person is to deal successfully with their addiction, they don't just have to deal with the chemical effect of addiction on the brain, they also have to deal with their mental health issues and their complex trauma issues. You have to deal with all three. If you only deal with one, you usually don't stay clean and sober because they all trigger and feed into each other. And so for most everybody that I deal with that has addiction and mental health issues, unless they start working on their mental health issues along with their complex trauma and addiction issues, they don't stay clean and sober. And if their addiction or mental health issues flare up, they have to be so careful because in a short period of time, they can cross a line of no return where it will drag them into such a dark place that they will relapse. And so dealing with mental health, being aware of your mental health is such an important part in addiction recovery, and it is such an important part in dealing with mental or complex trauma issues. And so the question that so many would have is, why is mental health such a dangerous thing for people from complex trauma and addiction? So we've mentioned about the relapse thing, but there's a couple other things that I want you to be aware of. Last week we talked about the fact that people from complex trauma don't do well sitting in unresolved emotions. They don't have very good distress intolerance, is what we call it. So this graph shows that the longer a person sits in emotional pain that they can't resolve, the greater the internal anxiety builds until they reach a pain threshold that they can't tolerate anymore, and it's fight, flight, freeze. They're out of here. And that is sitting in an unresolved emotion. And so last week we looked at one of the unresolved emotions that people sit in is the unknown and not knowing what's going to happen. There's a second type of emotion that you cannot resolve quickly, and that is grief. So if you've lost somebody very close to you, you have to go through the grieving process, and that takes a lot of time. So you have to sit in pain and anger and confusion and sadness for many months. The third thing that doesn't get resolved quickly are mental health issues. And so if you have depression or anxiety, you can't usually just magically make them go away. Even if you're on medication, which helps, you have to learn to sit in unresolved emotional pain. And people from complex trauma aren't good at doing that. The third thing is that emotions that are negative for people with complex trauma pull them in a negative direction. What I found very interesting a couple years ago as I was studying and researching is to think of the reality that the way we are designed emotionally is that emotions, positive and negative, are designed to pull us in a positive direction. So if I feel fear, I move towards safety. If I feel anger, it's because of something unloving happening, and I move to resolve that and return it to loving. So emotions pull me in a positive direction. Complex trauma, the child tries to resolve negative emotions and they get punished. They can't resolve them. So their only way of surviving is to respond in negative ways, stuff down, isolate, bury anger, all of those things. And so now for people from complex trauma, negative emotions, so mental health type emotions, depression and anxiety, pull them in a self-destructive direction. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Think of something else. When you think of anger for a person from complex trauma, it is probably the most intense emotion, and it pulls them very powerfully to fight or flight, and usually in harmful ways. But then it passes. It's short in duration. And so they get past that escalation and they can settle down. The thing that happens with mental health, depression, and anxiety It's not just a short duration, intense thing. It goes on day after day. So today you could wake up feeling depressed and not feeling like doing anything, but you force yourself to spend some time meditating and journaling and connecting with a friend. But after you're done, it doesn't make you feel any better. And the next day you wake up and you don't feel like doing anything again. And it's like you start from scratch all over again, forcing yourself every day to fight the natural pull, which is I want to isolate, I don't want to talk to anybody. All of those things, you deal with it day after day after day, and it doesn't go away. And for many people, it eventually wears them down, and they say, screw it, I can't do this any longer. And that is what makes mental health such a dangerous thing for people coming out of complex trauma. So let me just develop this complex trauma part a little bit more. So complex trauma, if you're not familiar with it, is when a child feels safe in an ongoing way. So they are either abused or they're neglected or they're abandoned, and they don't feel that anybody's there for them, and they feel all alone in a world, and it's a dangerous place. And so fear becomes the overriding emotion that they feel. But with that is ongoing anxiety and depression because their world sucks and it's not a good place. And so that is where it begins to happen. But what is important to understand is that complex trauma does affect more than just the emotional world. It does affect the emotional world negatively, but it also affects their thinking negatively over a long period of time. They become more negative, critical, jump to worst case scenario, distorted in their thinking. All of those changes take place. It affects how they relate to other people negatively, and it affects how they cope, how they handle impulses that they experience, how they handle stress, how they handle pain. All of those it affects negatively. Now, the important thing to understand in the world of mental health is that the more severe the complex trauma, the more severe the brain has to develop a response to survive. There's another piece to that. If you look at complex trauma, the child goes, why am I being abused or neglected or abandoned? It must be me, I'm bad. So the more severe the abuse, abandonment, neglect, the more terrible the child thinks they are. And so the brain has to survive by responding to that. And that needs a severe compensation in the brain to try and cope with all of that stuff. So, what comes out of those severe responses are what we call personality disorders. So a psychologist will sit down and he will say, I think the severe response here looks like this. Bang, bang, bang. Okay, I see that in other people. I see that in other people. Let's call that borderline personality disorder. And then there's a little different kind of response pattern here. Let's kind of chart that and watch it in different people. And we'll call that narcissistic personality disorder. And over here's a different one. We'll call that obsessive compulsive disorder. So all of the different patterns of responding to danger are given a title called a personality disorder. And the more severe the complex trauma, the more severe those personality disorders become. And so that has a profound effect. Okay, let me take that a bit further. When you think of mental health, you often think of things that are ongoing. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, they're there as ongoing states that the person has to deal with. Okay? But those things can also be triggered to get worse through stress, through loneliness, through isolation. So they're constant, but they can be influenced and triggered by events that are going on in a person's life, okay? Second thing, those disorders like borderline, etc., they may not even be seen in normal life as people live and go to work and do their own thing, but they show up when deep issues from complex trauma get triggered. So if their abandonment gets triggered, if they feel rejection, feel fear, then their borderline will flare up and it will be triggered in a big way. So that is important to understand. So now let me just see if you can relate to depression or anxiety. So a lot of people that grow up with complex trauma, they end up with anxiety and depression, and they don't even realize that they have it because it's always been their normal. So let me just take you through depression and anxiety, and you can see if those are true of you, okay? So two types of depression. Number one, we call a chemical imbalance. So you're born with your brain just not producing enough of the right chemicals. You need medication for that. And sometimes that can be brought on by seasonal affective disorder due to the amount of sunlight or the length of the daylight. That can create a change in brain chemicals as well. So that's important to understand. Secondly, is circumstantial depression. So you're in very overwhelming, painful, difficult, hard, discouraging circumstances, and you then are depressed. Or you have so much shame, you just don't like yourself, you're depressed about who you are, and then you have a lot of depression. So that can be a common thing as well. So what are the symptoms of depression? So for most people that live with depression, they would say that they feel like they're being sucked into a black hole. They just feel like the light is going out. They're being dragged into this dark place. With that, they begin to lose interest in everything that normally interests them. So they don't feel motivated to do what they normally do. What usually gives them pleasure doesn't give them pleasure anymore. And life becomes drudgery for them. It's like being a robot. They just put one foot in front of the other. Everything takes effort, but nothing gives pleasure. Nothing is enjoyable. Nothing excites them. Then they can also then feel very much worthless. What good am I? I can't do anything. I don't enjoy anything. I'm sure everybody else sees me as a terrible person, and they start feeling worthless, and they think others just see them as a burden and a pain, and nobody wants them in their life because they're no fun. But then they can't drag themselves out of it. People say, just pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. Just put a smile on your face. And they try all of that, but nothing works. And so they feel helpless to overcome all of this depression, though they're trying as hard as they can. And then they just feel they can't cope anymore. Everything is so overwhelming and so difficult for them. And that becomes very, very hard. So those are just feelings of feeling trapped in this very difficult place. The next thing that happens is you begin to feel more and more antisocial. You might used to have not maybe enjoyed social, but if you got there, you enjoyed it. Now you don't even enjoy it when you get there. And the idea of having to talk to somebody or make a phone call or go to a social thing or connect just makes you cringe inside and you want to run away. You get a panicky feeling at the thought of having to interact with other people. And so the desire to isolate deepens inside the person. Then the other thing is you become more and more irritable. So all of your emotional gas tank is on empty. You have no gas left to deal with life. It's all being consumed by the depression. And so now everything is too much to take. Everything is annoying. Everything is irritating. And so you just find yourself irritable, and then your whole perspective becomes more negative, more pessimistic, quick to find fault, quick to just be critical about stuff. So you're going into a darker place as this progresses. Some people go through changes in appetite. They either want to eat all the time or they don't want to eat at all. They gain weight or lose weight. Others go through changes in sleeping. They want to sleep all the time or they don't sleep very much at all. Some experience physical pain on top of the emotional pain, and others experience overwhelming tiredness, fatigue all the time. Getting out of the bed just seems so difficult because you're so exhausted. And then as you go through your day, you have trouble concentrating, you have trouble remembering stuff, you get crazy thinking, you lose your perspective on stuff, and you just kind of get tunnel vision and only see certain pieces and miss the big picture. It's a very, very dangerous place to be. The brain doesn't like living in that. And so what's been happening all the time is the brain is looking for solutions. It is looking for something to help feel better, but nothing has worked. And so after a while, the brain will begin to think of suicide as the only solution. Life is not worth living. There's nothing to fix this. I'm a burden to everybody. I might as well end it. Now, for a lot of people, it doesn't develop beyond suicidal ideation, but for others, it can. The other thing the brain might go to is, I'm not going to commit suicide, but I will return to drugs and alcohol. They're the only thing that seems to numb all of this pain that I'm feeling. Some people just get wrapped up in distractions, addiction to movies, video games, etc. So it pulls you to this dark place where you either go to addiction, and that can be drugs, alcohol, or activities, or to this just dead place, or even suicidal places. So if you've been experiencing those, and you would have to experience at least 5 of them, then you would be classed as struggling with depression. And I expect that many of you go through most of all of those. The second one is anxiety. So it's interesting to me that people who struggle with depression usually also struggle with anxiety. The two go together. And so if your depression is your primary diagnosis, when it gets triggered, usually your anxiety increases as well. So what are some of the symptoms of anxiety? And again, you may have lived with this for so long, it's your normal, and you don't even realize it's not normal, that it's anxiety. So anxiety affects your thinking. So you can persistently are worrying about things, but as you step away or others step away and look at the things you're worrying about, they go, that's not even a big deal. Why are you worrying so much about something so insignificant? But you don't see it that way. You're worrying about stuff out of proportion to what the significance is. Some of people start worrying that they're not able to let go of worry. And they are worrying that they're worrying too much. And then if they're not worrying, they're worrying that they maybe aren't worrying enough. And so worry just becomes part of it. And they can't let it go. And that is a sign of anxiety. Also with anxiety, difficulty in concentrating. So the mind can go blank. You can have what they call brain fog, where you just kind of hit this cramp in your brain where you can't think for a bit. That can happen because of anxiety. When you face a decision, anxiety has great distress because there's fear of making the wrong decision. another sign of anxiety. And then when you face a decision, you think through all the options. And then you have to think through every possible detail that could come out of every option, every possible consequence. And you obsess and you drive people crazy. And all of those conclusions, though, when you stop and back away, all end up negative. So every consequence as you play out for every option ends up being a negative conclusion. So all of your thinking out of anxiety takes you to negative conclusions. And then you start believing lies within yourself, lies about life and happiness, and it becomes a lot of second guessing, a lot of confusion internally, and then you just don't like anything that's uncertain. You want everything black and white, everything to be nailed down tight, so you never have to have any uncertainty at all, because that just creates more anxiety. So that's what's going on in the mental part. Physically, you can, again with anxiety, have trouble sleeping, clenched jaws, tensed muscles, grinding your teeth at night or during the day, pressure headaches, irritability, nauseous diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome, all kinds of different things. Some people with extreme anxiety, they can actually see stars at the periphery of their vision, or it can go dark at the periphery of their vision. They can feel their body, their heart pumping and sweat and all of those things. So that is anxiety. Now let me come back to depression and anxiety create a negative pull on people with complex trauma. It pulls you in the direction that is self-destructive. That is so important to understand. So let me develop that so that you see just how serious this is. Because if you're dealing with anxiety and depression right now, you will probably relate to most of those things. So with relationships, you tend to want to isolate and not connect. Many of you will become like a porcupine. Anybody gets too close, they're going to get quills shot into them. You don't want to talk as much with your partner or your close friends because that's just too much work. You lash out of your irritations and say things that you later regret. And then part of what can happen with depression is you get to such a dark place you just want to close your heart to everybody and to life, and that hurts your relationships badly. So it pulls you in a direction that will greatly damage relationships. When it comes to responsibilities, anxiety and depression, they pull you in a direction that says, let's procrastinate. Let's just avoid dealing with these problems because I don't feel like it. And then you spend a lot of time thinking about how to get out of responsibilities rather than actually doing them. And it pulls you in the direction of either becoming very lazy or doing jobs but doing them half-heartedly because you just don't have the energy to commit yourself 100%. And so your responsibilities start to struggle and you start to fail in those areas. Then your emotions. It affects you in a negative way. So the longer you're in depression and anxiety and you can't resolve it, you want to start to, I don't want to feel, I want to numb. And so that's when distractions and addiction become very attractive ways of coping. Depression and anxiety are demotivators. They make you passive. That's the pull. They make you so you don't want to plan. And so what you do is you say, I'll just do what I feel like today. And I don't feel like doing anything, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do a to-do list. I'm not going to plan or commit to anything. I'm just going to follow my feelings. Very disastrous for somebody from complex trauma. So, what do we do? healthy tools for dealing with all of this. And I hope that you will see that in my mind, there are very practical things that we all can do, but there's a process of learning how to manage your own mental health that takes time to figure it out. But I want you to hear that there's nothing wrong with seeking medical help if you're really struggling right now. Because if you don't seek medical help and you get worse, you could get past that line of no return and relapse, and it's too late. So get medical help if you're not able to find the tools necessary to get you stabilized again. So important. So next thing I want you to understand is there's not a quick fix here. So be prepared that you're going to have to sit in these uncomfortable emotions, and that's okay. They won't kill you. You can learn to sit in them in a healthy way. So if my wife was to ask me in the morning, how are you doing? I could say, I'm struggling with depression, but I'm okay. And what I mean by that is I'm struggling with depression, but I'm managing it well, and I'm getting stabilized here. If I was struggling with depression and not managing it well, then that depression would be getting worse, 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 and then it would become a dangerous thing. So the next thing that is so important when you're struggling with mental health is self-care. Get the sleep, eat, exercise. Those become important just to keep a routine. And force yourself to do that routine. There's going to be so much in you that pulls you from wanting to do that routine. But I have found by forcing myself to do that routine plays a big role in helping me to get stable. One of the things that mental health things force us to do is to say, okay, I don't have as much energy right now to do what I'd normally do. So what is the most important pieces of my life? What are my priorities? What are the things that I must do if I'm going to make it? So I begin to realize there's certain things that if I don't do them every day, I'm in big trouble. There's some things, they're optional. I can do them if I have energy, but if I don't have to do them. It's not going to affect me negatively. And so what is important at this time if you're struggling is to figure that out. What are the essentials and what are the non-essentials in my life right now so that I'm not putting my energy into non-essentials, but I'm doing the essentials. And that's significant because depression and anxiety pull me to want to do the non-essentials and to resist doing the essentials. So don't lose track of that. Then mindfulness, grounding and mindfulness. On a regular basis every day, ground yourself. Get out of your limbic brain into your cortex. Talk to yourself. Coach yourself. Say, you can do this. Here's what you have to, as priorities today. Here's what you're committing yourself to do. You're going to feel a bit of irritation, but just get through that, and you can work yourself through that. The next one to me is such an important thing. The worst thing when you're struggling with depression and anxiety is isolation. We need either connection or we need activity to get us out of the house. We need to get out of our head is the bottom line. And so I know in my own life, if I get into a depressed place in my head and I get stuck in my head, that is super dangerous. Sometimes I can get myself out of my head, but sometimes I can't unless I get out of the house. And as I get out of the house, that helps me get out of my head. Another important distinction for people with depression and anxiety is learning the difference between withdrawing from people and isolating from people. Withdrawing from people is important, especially for introverts. That's how you recharge your batteries. But it's easy to cross a line into isolation, which leads to dark places in our head. So learn where that line is, especially in this time. So the other important piece is connection. But let me say this. When you talk to somebody, don't talk to somebody who's going to then want to try and fix you. That will just make you more irritated. Have people that understand depression and anxiety, who will hear you, who will validate you, who will support you. They might, if you are open to it, give you a couple suggestions, but they're not going to try and jump in and fix you. One of the things you have to learn with depression and anxiety is bite your tongue a lot. You will be irritated. You will want to lash out. Not worth it. Bite your tongue. And don't forget how big of a relapse issue this is. So watch for warning signs that you're sliding towards a relapse. Be aware of the areas that you become vulnerable when you are extra depressed or have extra anxiety. That is so important. That self-awareness that I am not stable, I am going downhill. And that is a scary thing. Next thing, remember truth. It is really important for people with depression and anxiety to realize that we can still choose what we focus our minds on. Depression wants to focus on negative. Anxiety wants to focus on negative. It wants to jump to worst case scenario and awfulize everything. I don't have to do that. I can choose truth. And so one exercise that you can have is when you're in depression and anxiety is keep track of the thoughts that run through your head and ask yourself, which ones of those are a lie? Because some of those will be a lie. And they're going to say, you can't do this, this is too much, etc. Then you can say, okay, what is the truth? And that takes you back to your cortex. That takes you back to where you need to be to fight this. If depression and anxiety can keep you believing lies, it is won. It has defeated you. You have to hang on to truth in the middle of this. And that is sometimes where a friend can be a good sounding board and tell you, you are believing a lie right there. That is not true at all. Next one, don't close your heart. Everything about depression and anxiety wants to gradually just close your heart to everybody. Like an animal that's wounded, you want to curl up in a corner in a cave and snarl at the world. Don't go there. That is when you get to a very dangerous place if you do that. And finally, I would add a spiritual component. It is so important for me in not closing my heart to open my heart consciously, to surrender, to trust. And I open my heart to my wife. I open my heart to my God, and I surrender and I trust. And it might not make me feel immediately better, but it is so important for helping me find stability. So if you're struggling through this COVID-19 social isolation with mental health issues that have been triggered, my heart goes out to you. It is a very dark, awful place to be. I would encourage you to try these tools. And if you've tried these tools for a week and you're still not feeling better, please seek medical help, because this only will get worse for you in a dangerous way. But try these tools as you go into this weekend and this week, and I hope that it will just help you begin to manage this depression and anxiety a little bit better. For the Christian part, so we're following Israel as they come out of slavery in Egypt, and God is leading them under the leadership of Moses to the land he promised them, which is modern-day Israel. And he takes them first to Mount Sinai. They spend a whole lot of time there. That they get the 10 Commandments there, a whole new way of having a healthy society. After coming out of a very unhealthy society, they get a religion there and get to know their God. And now they move towards the Promised Land. And so tonight they're standing on the edge of the Promised Land. And Moses sends in 12 men, one from each of the tribes of Israel, to go and spy out the land. Now, here's the parallel that I want you to think of as we talk about tonight. So they're looking at the Promised Land, okay? They've just spent the last year in therapy. If you think about it, they could have got to the Promised Land in a couple weeks. But God did it in a year. So he purposely dragged out that travel time to the Promised Land from being just a couple weeks that they could have got there to being a whole year. And he was teaching them about himself. He was teaching them that he loved them unconditionally. He was teaching them how committed he was, how faithful he was. And that was an important part of their therapy. But more than that, he was helping them begin to face their fears, helping them begin to grow. And so he would push them out of their comfort zone. He would give them a new challenge. And they would complain, but then he would come through for them. And so I want you to picture yourself, if you're in recovery, that what the people of Israel have gone through for the last year is very much like what treatment center would be, where you're spending time just focusing on learning basic tools and getting basic skills and understanding and self-awareness. Okay, so now they're standing at the edge of the Promised Land. Spies are sent in, and they're asked to give a report of what the Promised Land was like. And they come back and say, it's fantastic. It blows your mind. It is so wonderful. So here you are in recovery. You've come through treatment, and now you're ready to go into the rest of your life. And somebody comes back and says, this could be a wonderful life. This has the potential for so many blessings for you. Now, the first thing I want you to understand is this. God brought Israel to the edge of the Promised Land, and the 12 spies went in and came back, and he gave them a glimpse of how wonderful their new life could be. God wants to bless them. God's not about making their life painful or hard or a mean, grumpy God that just likes to send a whole bunch of bad things. God's deepest desire for them was to bless them in the greatest way possible. Okay, now here you are, coming out of treatment, standing on the edge of this new life of recovery, and you want to follow God into that, and God says, I want to bless you. I want to give you the greatest life possible. Now here's where the problem comes in. When the spies came back, they said it's going to be a ton of work. We're going to have to fight a lot of battles to take over this wonderful land. And what happens to people in recovery? They see this wonderful new life ahead of them, but then they go, in order to experience, I'm going to have to fight a lot of battles. Do you want to know what the children of Israel did? They said, we're not going to go into the Promised Land. And do you want to know what I've seen so many people in recovery do? When they see the number of battles they're going to have to fight, the amount of work it's going to take to experience this new wonderful life, they say, no, not going to go there. And they relapse. And the children of Israel refuse to go in. Now let me read you what happened, because I want you just kind of get a sense of the flow of all of this. So the Lord now said to Moses, send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. Send one leader from each of the 12 tribes. So Moses instructed the 12 men, go see what the land is like and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. So do some recon. See what kind of land they live in. Is it a good or bad? So is it a good farming land? Do their towns have walls, or are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see. So he says, take your time. Go from one end to the other. See what this land is like, what the people are like, and bring a full report that would both have military value, farming value, every type of settling into a new society value. Let us know. So after exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned. And here's what they said. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a beautiful, bountiful country. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. Now, what you need to understand at this point is that 10 of the 12 spies give this negative report and basically say this land is too dangerous, the enemy is too powerful, we will never overcome them, this is a stupid venture. 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, no, we can win because God has promised to fight for us. But when the people hear it, here's what it says. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt, even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. But the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. And they said, we are not going to go in to the land of Egypt. Absolutely amazing. God promised it to them. The spies said it is wonderful. But here's what they began to understand. If we go into that land, we are going to have to fight battles. And we're going to have to fight against strong enemies. Enemies that have fortified cities, strongholds, that are going to be very hard to get over. That means not only danger and battle where some people could die, but then we're going to have a lot of hard work. God's not just going to give us this land by magically waving the wand and making it simple, problem-free, just move in, everything will be great. No, it's going to be hard work. And there's going to be lots of risk of being hurt. But what it really boiled down to was this. Would they trust God or not to keep his promise? Now, for the last year, God has fed 2 to 3 million people every day in a desert. And he has provided water. He did the plagues to get them out of Egypt. They have seen that regardless of the obstacle or opposition or how impossible it looks, God always keeps his promises, even when it seems humanly impossible. But they just forgot all about that. And so, not liking sitting in this unknown of what this new land might involve, they go to a very negative place. Now, just look at their response, because it is a complex trauma response when extreme fear is triggered. So they had a rapid escalation of emotion, 0 to 100 in a nanosecond. And with that fear emotion came anger. And it came with great intensity. Then they jumped to the worst case scenario in their thinking. And they began to exaggerate the negatives of the situation and lost sight of the positives. And then they lashed out in anger at those who had encouraged them to take a risk. And they end up wanting to murder Joshua and Caleb. Total distortions, total negative response. Total response, when you look at it objectively, you go, that is not even close to being accurate, or they are crazy, they're irrational in their thinking, but that's what the fear response did. And so they refused to take a risk. They refused to trust God in spite of everything God had done. And so in their mind, at that point, to move forward would not mean that God would keep his promise. To move forward means certain death for everybody. So the best option in their mind was to return to Egypt, to slavery once again. And so what do? They turn back towards Egypt. They sabotage everything they have been working towards, everything they have been hoping for, and they reach the conclusion that God could not keep his promise, and they give it all up because they were afraid to trust. They sabotaged it all. And you want to know what God did? God said, you will not enter and occupy this land that I promised to you. The only exceptions will be Joshua and Caleb. You said your children would be carried off as plunder if we went into that land. Well, I will bring your children with Joshua and Caleb safely into the land, and they will enjoy what you have despised. But as for you, you will drop dead in the wilderness. And so over 1 million people wandered around the desert for the next 39 years until they all dropped dead, except for their children, Joshua and Caleb, and they went into the promised land. You want to know what I've seen, sadly, over and over again, is people, they come out of addiction, they come out of all of the mess they've created with complex trauma coping skills. They want a better life. They want to be free of all of that. They get freedom, and then they find out it's hard work. Then they find out it's going to have some battles. Then they find out that they're going to have to take a lot of risks at times, and they sabotage it all. Some go looking for a Christianity where they think God's going to wave a magic wand and make it all easy. And I say to people, I doubt that will happen. I'm pretty sure it won't. This journey of getting healthy is not a magic pill that you take. It's like the children of Israel going into the promised land where you're fighting against an enemy that has strongholds. But if you walk faithfully with God, he will keep his promise. And you will grow and you will begin to experience the blessings of this promised land. I hope you don't sabotage it once you begin to realize how difficult it can be. And it's very easy if you're struggling with depression and anxiety to go to that negative place and say it's too hard, it's too much, and just focus on the negative and then sabotage it. Go back to what God has promised, that he has promised to give us this good land if we will surrender to him and trust him and take the risks that he's asked us to take.